Hi, Intuitive viewers. Welcome and welcome today, especially because I am so excited to actually introduce. I think, Andre, I think you're the first astrologer that I've
Oh,
ever had on the channel.
nice.
So
I'm
welcome.
flattered.
A long time coming, right?
Uh,
So yeah, welcome and yeah,
Thank
congratulations.
you.
So for some reason it you broke through.
Happy to be
This
here.
brain, because I find astrology, as we were talking about before, I find astrology very there's a lot to it. There's just a lot. There's a lot to understand, and there's a lot to it, and a lot of things that I don't think I quite get. But maybe you can enlighten me a little bit today, and enlighten those who are on the same page that I am a little bit with astrology. But I kind of want to. Your channel is called Astrology Alert,
Hmm.
and you do a lot of politics and
Hmm.
that kind of thing, and you look back at history, and we'll get into that. But I kind of want to know where did this start for you? What age were you, and what kind of brought you into this world of astrology?
Uh, well, it certainly wasn't there in my early upbringing, as in a family member introduced me to it, or, like some people will say, I'm musical because my parents played instruments, that kind of thing. None, zero. Uh, this started, I trace it back when I was 21 and 21 and a half or so for other reasons, because I wasn't thinking astrology, but I learned to meditate just because at the time I thought it would be good for me. And if you had asked me what I was doing, I would have said a few things, but very different from the way I understood it later. But the main point is, within a few months, I started to notice my mind was changing into, other thoughts, other perceptions. And one of the things that kept popping in was this sense that there might be something to where the planets are and astrology, and it was just a feeling and an internal sense, but nothing too defined. Then it still took another few months before I actually thought to, okay, go to the occult shop, because this was around when computers were coming online, so there were no real computers yet to calculate charts. So I
Right.
bought books that taught you how to do it, and I started playing around, drawing charts. And then, and this is where it can get a little strange, where people will say things like, well, maybe you were an astrologer in a past lifetime, or things like that. Just in the sense that it did grow up pretty quickly. I got this sense of what was going on. It's not terribly complicated to learn how to do charts, but you have to be, reasonably good at basic arithmetic and, say, grade 9 and 10 geometry. I mean, really simple stuff. But
Mhm.
if that is too daunting, then it'll hold you back. It didn't for me. So I started playing around, and I started to notice that once I understood a few of the principles, I looked back 2 years before, when there had been no astrology. I mean, I knew because I remembered,
Mhm.
and I have a pretty good memory. That also helps. I think remembering where you were at different points is really helpful.
Mhm.
So
Right.
I noticed there were two or three things that I thought, this is just so weird, because the planet indicating this. Like, I had, to give you an example, I looked back to around age 14. I went through this period where I had a really difficult stomach problem for a couple of months. And I was really sick. I went to the doctor. It was really because I was eating poorly, but, you know, the main point here isn't so much what the cause was, but just that I didn't feel good. But I
Right.
noticed that by then I already understood this planet is the stomach planet for sure, and I could see the cycle, and I thought, that's just so weird. Why would it be there at that point? So then that encourages you to keep looking, and I found a couple more where I thought, okay, that's again strange that right around that date this thing was happening. So then it's just a matter of continuing to look and look and look, and you just keep accruing more and more correlations, right? And especially, always, the most important tool has been my own chart. To keep looking and what's going on here, what am I feeling, what's taking place, and then you
Mhm.
branch out and you see other people's charts as well and see what they're doing, and from there you go to studying public figures and so on. But at the beginning, my focus was, you know, if not exclusively, mostly just my own chart, as I was trying to learn how it worked, and I could feel the planets moving. Literally, I could tell, where they were, especially something like the moon, which moves quickly. It's giving you a very short view. But knowing the mechanics reasonably well is really helpful to even do that. Otherwise, what tends to happen is you're caught more by the story than by the measurement, and then
Mm.
you're making things up, and it's not as real. So that's a summary of how I got into it. But probably to me the most interesting thing is that it came on as a result of meditating, which I think in a sense with meditation the key thing that it does is it puts you more in touch with yourself. I think it's one of
Mhm.
my understandings around it, and that was probably buried in there, waiting to emerge in some way, because that it sure did. After that it became an important thing. So
And good for you for listening to that, because I think sometimes people can get things in meditation, but just kind of it's just things are just coming into my head. But good for you for kind of following it and listening to that. That's the hard part, right?
yeah,
Um,
true, true.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the thing that caught me that changed astrology for me, because to be honest, one of the most accurate kind of assessment readings for me was an astrologer.
Ah,
And so I know there's validity to it. I absolutely believe that there's validity to it. For me, it was confusing. I couldn't wrap my head around all of the in this house and rising and all of these terms that you probably use all the time. But I was like, what does that mean?
yeah, yeah.
What really turned the corner for me was a video that I saw that someone sent to me with you and I guess with your sister
Ah,
talking about Pluto.
mm,
And it's a long video, but it is fascinating from start to finish. And you basically go through, I think it's 100, I think you do 100 years of Pluto or something like that, or 150 years of Pluto through history, and where you can kind of see, and that's what it is, right? It's the patterns that you see
patterns.
that
Right,
start to line up, and then you can say, oh, that's what that is. Oh yes, I can see Pluto here again and here again.
right.
And it is so fascinating. What I found so interesting, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this, is where Pluto was during around the time of World War II and right before, and where it is now. Because I felt like there was some real correlations there with
Right,
kind of the rise
right.
of fascism and that kind of brutal force kind of energy,
Correct.
or yeah.
Right, right, right. So that related to Pluto. Pluto was discovered in 1930, I believe, right in that range. And so the 30s up to, I believe it's 41 or 42. It's in that range in there. So, and I think maybe the late 20s too. It's about Pluto, depending on where it is in its orbit, because it's a huge 250-year orbit. It doesn't travel equal amounts per sign. Depending on where it is in that big ellipse, it can spend less time or more time in a sign. As it turns out, I believe that one was fairly quick, but it's still more than a decade. And
Right.
that axis, like when you in astrology, when you talk about Cancer Capricorn, Cancer Capricorn is the axis of government. Capricorn and Cancer is the home, like a person's private life, but it
Mhm.
has a connection to also to the homeland, and it's a very important axis. Things really pivot around that, and so Pluto was in Cancer during those years, and that's the correlation with fascism. There was this, it wasn't just Hitler. There was, the Empire of the Right of the Sun, in Japan,
Mhm.
Mussolini, Franco. There were all these fascists, and you could also say, the world maneuvered itself into this condition around that time, and that's what was
Right.
happening. Then it switches signs, pretty much approximately. I mean, not exactly, because it's never perfectly exact, but as it moved toward the next sign, that passed and we went into a different era. And this time around, 2008, is when Pluto enters Capricorn, and it's in Capricorn until 2025, 26, if you want to be more pessimistic, or even you could say till next year if you're really being optimistic, because it'll dip a little bit into Aquarius and then it backtracks in Capricorn again, goes forward again. So this whole swath, things get more turbulent and you see this rise. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the post Obama years, especially, because that's another thing that's really curious. You look at these planets and they go into a sign. And I remember looking at the 2016, 2017 period when Trump came on the scene. And
Right.
that's like the middle of the sign. It's like the planet is gone as far as it'll go to the center. The thing is really entrenched. And then from there, it starts to ebb, go the other way, which you see
Mhm.
now. Pluto now is at 27, 28. It's getting to near the end of the sign. And the way I'm looking at this, these fascists are not progressing. They're losing ground. You can see,
Right.
for instance, Bolsonaro. He didn't win, he lost. Or you see
Right.
Putin's, I mean, that's not working. And Trump, I mean, please, I'm amazed. I'm amazed that the GOP can't figure it out. You're following a loser and you'll keep losing.
I
So you got to
I
drop
know.
to that. Right? But the problem is that he's
Should be
created,
obvious.
yeah, I know. It's incredible, but he's created, his genius is he has these followers, right? And
Right.
they're totally hypnotized. And now I'm even wondering if he told them, hey, I made it all up. It's wrong. They might still, take another year or two to deprogram themselves. But the
Right.
point being, Pluto is moving to the next sign. And this is astrology 101. These cycles definitely work. They bring about change. And you could say life is all about change anyway. There's a constant
Right.
shifting of patterns. But for sure, yeah, you put it in, even now historically, right, those two signs, you know that it's a tricky situation for the world because it's been pretty dicey. Not just here. Like look at Brexit in Europe and different places where this idea of fascism. And the reason is, by the way, this is where it gets even stranger. But I like this part because,
Right.
in my mind, the great part of astrology or the great angle on it is that it's all at once mathematical, but it's also magical because you see these coincidences that are strange, such as, for example, scientists tend to be dismissive of astrology. They're always looking for ways to say, "Oh, that's just come on, this is." In fact, they hate it when if you present evidence at all, then they start arguing with the evidence. They don't like the idea at all of having this be in any way true, right?
Right.
But they're the ones, scientists themselves, they're almost never will you find that a scientist who's a mythologist or something. That's not going to happen. But they name these planets. They're the ones that say, well, we're going to call it Pluto.
Right.
And it turns out that it is Pluto because, well, you heard when my sister was talking about this, she's really good at researching the archetypes. What is the story of the mythology of Pluto who abducts Persephone, takes her into the underworld, and
Right.
she's going along with him, sort of, but not really. There's this story around it, and you discover Pluto is the idea of it because Pluto is the a higher octave of Mars. Mars is the male symbol, so Pluto is the super male. So then,
Right.
of course, you're going to get a fascist on the dark side. You're going to get someone who
Right.
wants to dominate and control and centralize the power. It's totalitarianism. It's total
Yeah.
centering. Trump saying only I can fix it. He's coming
Yeah,
out of
exactly.
that Pluto energy. But it's fascinating to see that because there's no logic, no regular logic to say, well, why would you call this Pluto? Or the new one now in 2005, this new planetoid is discovered, and it happens to be approximately the same size as Pluto, but they're both very small because both of them are about the size of the moon. And when you think the moon is pretty small, and you have this thing
Mhm.
way out there spinning around. So then that's what Pluto's been doing for, the time we've been watching it. Now you have another one, and it turns out that the astronomer who discovered this new body, this was my sister's research. She
Uh-huh.
found his chart and she saw that he has planets challenging his own Pluto in his chart. And he's the one that took down Pluto. He said, we can't count Pluto anymore. Pluto gets demoted. But the problem is you can't demote anything astrologically. Once it's been
Right.
brought it's there forever. It's in consciousness. It exists.
That's right.
Well, the new
Mhm.
one, they named it after a female warrioress, right? As soon as that happens, you know that women's power is rising. Plain and simple.
Mhm.
It's in fact, Eris is like the counterpoint to Pluto. It's the idea of female energy that embodies the male principle. And she's the sister of Mars, and
Mhm.
so it's quite combative.
Right.
And you've seen since 2005, by hook or by crook, people that have been left behind in multiple areas, not just by gender, but by other categories because that's the whole
Mhm.
idea around Eris is an angry goddess who has been left off the table, and she's taking revenge by taking what she wants. And so
Right.
you're seeing this over the years, and in a to me in a interesting way with Trump, what he's doing. I think historically, when people look back, they're going to say this guy, through the unintended consequence, he came on as this this ultra male, like he wants to be an alpha male. I'm in
Right.
charge. The
Right.
idea of linking to Russia, Russia is trying to be a masculine country, right? Well, the problem with that
Right.
is you do this and you bring more women into power who resist
Right.
you, and now you've got more senators, more House representatives, probably sooner or later a president. You see, like for instance, look at the blowback to Putin. He invades Ukraine because he's worried about NATO, and what happens immediately? Sweden and Finland want to join NATO, and I remember looking, and you see two women in charge of the countries, and you think, this planet is laughing at you, man. It's laughing at you because here you are, you're trying to enforce, the male power, and you're getting the very opposite. So,
Right.
in that
Right.
sense, strangely, he becomes Trump becomes an accidental agent for progress through the back door, so to speak. But even so,
Right.
strictly speaking, I think the sooner he's out of the picture, the better, because as I understand it, leadership is really powerful, and people like this are really dangerous because they cause other people to follow them, and then you know uh,
Right.
all the stuff that we keep hearing that is really irritating is because of him. Carrie
Yeah,
Lake,
you're
and
really irritating. Yes.
I mean, like, where did you hear? Where did you first hear? I'm not going to accept the results of the election. That's Trump.
Right. That's
That's
exactly
and they're
right.
all copying him. Yeah. So yeah, maybe
Well,
that was
and that
wrong.
kind of leads me, you kind of mentioned what I wanted to ask you about next and where this would come from. So this idea of this whatever this is, that these Trump people that have this kind of these delusional ideas, that cultish kind of like uh you know the Q stuff, the just weird off the wall conspiracy theories, that kind of thing. So we saw that back in the 1970s. I don't know if you remember we had a ton of cult stuff in the 1970s. Parents were hiring people to pull their kids into vans and deprogram them. That was like the late 70s, with like the Moonies and all of that stuff. And then you go back further and you have like Nazi Germany, same kind of thing where people are just believing whatever they're told. Is there a planet or a way that planets are aligned that lend itself to that kind of thing? Because I don't remember a time quite like this where people are, it's almost like a mass delusion or a mass
Mhm.
uh I don't know, some kind of delusion that people are under, or just willing to believe such weird things. Yeah, what do you think about that? Or where do you
Well,
think that?
yeah, I mean, you can in different eras though you can pin it sometimes to different planets. But for example, Pluto is one of the ones that can pull you in this direction
Okay.
because it's very intense and has tremendous effect. So, like the 1930s, you could argue that that whole fascism. I mean, think of Germany and like all of them follow this guy, and you kind of think, well, what are you guys doing? Why are you doing this? They just did.
Right.
Things just align that way, and the same
Right.
thing was happening in other places too. Then another planet that you find connected to this kind of thing is Neptune, because Neptune is a planet that on the high end, and this is another thing about planets that you have to remember is that they don't have a fixed expression. There's like a range, so
Right.
that they can function really well or really poorly, and that's actually the best way to read individual charts. Stop worrying about what it's going to do to you. Just move the planet up in its expression, so your life will express better, right? But the more unconscious you are and just flailing around and connecting to the planetary forces in call them low level ways, planet like Neptune, what's happened to Neptune is in 2011, which is just after Pluto had entered in 2008, enters Capricorn. 2011, Neptune enters Pisces. And what happened then is on the upside, if you look at the amount of information and spiritual teachings and things like this that you can find in video, in audio, I mean, I would have killed to get this kind of information back in, the 20th century. You had to go to the occult shop
Right.
and dig in, in some shelf. Oh yeah, there's this great master
Right.
from India. Now everything is there. So that's the upside. But the downside is that the down end of Neptune is disinformation and also delusion, where
Oh,
because
right.
Neptune is a planet where up here it's just pure spirit, and then below that, you know how one of the ideas of spirit and religion is faith and belief. They're really linked to imagination. You have this
Mhm.
sense that your imagination and your faith are together. Well, that's fine if it's benign, but if it's malignant, you start imagining things that aren't true. Like, for example, you could
Right.
say John F. Kennedy's coming back to Dallas. No, he's not coming back to Dallas, but you think that he
I
is.
heard he was.
No, I know, but that's like
So weird.
crazy Neptune. There were
Right.
people in 2000 and in 2021 after Biden was already sworn in and all of that. I was seeing people on my channel commenting. This woman said that she said, "Well, Trump is flying around the world on Air Force One, and he's still in charge." That's what she was saying. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense. No, it's true. Biden is not really the president. Trump is really the president. So I thought, you're posting this on a channel and other people are commenting. And I thought, this is really weird because you're all
Right.
part of this bubble, that you're creating. That's the danger of Neptune. But it's not that different than if you tell me, like in the 1970s. Well, first of all, the
Right.
1970s, it's interesting. Pluto went through Libra then. Libra is also at odds with the US chart. Because, see, separately, the other thing that's happening here is you've got the movement of the planets for everyone, but you can
Mhm.
look at a country, and the US is a Cancer country, born in July
Oh,
4th. So then when Pluto goes through Capricorn, Cancer, or Aries, Libra, because they're the four corners, you
mhm.
get more pressure and more of this kind of behavior. And Pluto was going through Libra during those years. They were actually pretty hard for the US because if you remember Watergate, and then there was
Mhm.
inflation, there
Yeah.
was the loss of Vietnam. It really wasn't a great period for the US
No.
as a result of that, right? And this is the thing that they're far enough apart that you kind of fall asleep and think, oh well, it was now everything is perfect. Well, it's perfect until it gets
No, it isn't. Yeah.
into another square or whatever. But at least we can say that in the near term, it is switching to the next sign, and
Right.
that changes the energy. And so far, what I've seen is totally contrary to this idea. Oh, this guy's going to come back and really cement his power over all of us.
Right. Right.
Honestly, at this point, my opinion, I hope he runs. I don't think he will, but I hope he does because he is the one way that they'll guarantee losing if they want to do that.
I agree. I agree
Yeah,
with that totally. And
exactly.
so, well, so let's get into kind of some politics on like a more what's happening right now. I thought it was very interesting because I think of psychically when I tap into Marjorie Taylor Greene and Laura Bobart, they're the same. They're very similar energies to me when I tap into them, but they had very different races. They had very different outcomes. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she just sailed right through, and Bobart is really having a problem. And so, what can you, if you've looked at their charts, or what is it that is making them have, even though they're basically saying the same stuff on the same page, the areas are different, but they're still red. So what could be happening in their charts that make them be having such different experiences in their races?
Well, okay, so here's where you run into a key problem in astrology, which is that if only every state were like California, where records are public and everybody's time is known. So it's really
Oh,
cool
right.
because you can
Mm-hmm.
find anybody's time and draw a proper chart. And the most of the time you can't. So I'll look at a chart where I know the day positions, but I don't know what is rising. When this whole thing about rising sign, you don't know that. I mean, you can start to
Right.
guess, but it's just too much work to do charts and figure out how a person
Right.
looks, and it's really complicated. And then the lunar position, because the moon moves about 12 to 15 degrees, like almost like half a sign in a day. So you don't
Mm-hmm.
know where it is. You've got some sense of a range, but you don't have the complete chart. And sometimes you can still tell. I said, looking at two charts that I have no time for, time of birth for, I
Hmm.
still thought Hobbs has a better chart than Kari Lake for the situation
Hmm.
we're in.
Hmm.
So we'll see. I mean, maybe something will save Lake. Usually it would be some time, that where the Jupiter or something nice is helping her. Uh,
Right.
so uh, now, as far as like your question was in what you're right, why the two different outcomes. So
Yeah.
then what typically happens is that something is happening in Marjorie Taylor Greene's chart that is for now making things easier for her. I did
Hmm.
look at her day chart and it's far from simple. Even as we speak, it's a complicated chart where it could easily correlate with this idea that, well, they're already measuring the drapes, but I wish they would wait until, all the votes are in before they
Right.
claim they're back in the House. But odds are Boebert, which I'll confess, that's one I haven't looked at, but I
Right.
bet you then see something a little bit like when I looked at Herschel Walker, whose time I also don't have, but he's on Aquarius. Saturn is going through Aquarius. If you attempt one of these moves with Saturn near your planets, it seldom works because Saturn that way is just it's a harsh energy. You need it to be out of the way or helpful. If it's on you, it's too
Right.
complicated. So chances are that's what it is, right? With
Right.
Bober. But again, you need times to really be more
To
precise.
pin it down personally, to pin it down to them personally. But that gives us a good idea, though, of what those kinds of things that can happen that just can throw you off just enough to make another outcome possible. And
Correct.
so I want to ask you about a Scorpios, right? Because I'm a Scorpio. I
Mm,
know Joe Biden's a Scorpio, right?
correct. Right.
So
Right. So Scorpio, you're a Scorpio with the sun in the first few degrees because if you're born, you're born in October, right? It's October. So,
October
uh,
29th, yeah.
right. So if you draw, there are 30 degrees in the sign corresponding with the 30 days approximately. The sun moves a little less than a degree, but on average, but it's roughly that. So you would see your sun, I think it's 6 degrees something Scorpio, but Biden is near the end of the sign. So he's 28, like almost at the end. 30 would be Sagittarius, next sign, right? So then, even with that alone, you know that in your case, a really pretty intense moment would have been the period of the insurrection because you had Saturn and Uranus both pointing at that sun. Saturn from Aquarius, 90 degrees, and Uranus from Taurus opposing. So it's really pushing into that sun.
Mhm.
And you might say, oh, yeah, I remember that because, well, that really affected me. But usually it's more than that. There will be other things swirling around that are complicating things because you've got two big planetary forces challenging you. But
Right.
then as they move out of there, because both planets move forward by 2022, they're not as pressuring the sun degrees. I think you have another one, though. You have another planet later in Scorpio. I think it's Neptune. Yeah, I think it's Neptune that is getting the pressure, but that'll be a different reason and
Right.
usually way less impactful than to the sun. But then with Biden, he's at the very end of the sign. So then this is my whole thing that I've been talking about since 2021. When I looked ahead, I thought, oh, what's happening in November of 22, and I saw the Jupiter station right in this month. Jupiter does this thing. It's called a station. Stations in astrology, you look in the ephemeris and you see either a D or an R. If it's an R, it's going to go stationary and it stops and then goes retrograde. And it's called a
Mhm.
station because the planet looks like it's really slowing down, and then it goes retrograde. Or it slow down to go direct, go the other way. So either way, planet like that becomes way more intense. It sends more energy. It's a little bit paradoxical because you'd think if the planet is moving fast, that makes it more powerful. It's the opposite. The more slow it's moving. But remember too though that it doesn't really do that. It's an optical illusion. Astrology is measured from the Earth perspective, from where you are. Everything is around
Mhm.
you. So
Mhm.
these planets, they don't do retrograde. If they were doing retrograde in the sky, it would be like a circus in the
Right.
solar system. They go forward, but the Earth changes its trajectory such that you think they're going back, like Mercury retrograde, all those
Right.
things, right?
Right.
But the end result is that the station radiates a lot of power, and it's a really favorable station for Biden. Now, you can then say, well, Yeah, it's been pretty good. I mean, based on what could have happened, it's
Right,
already great. But
right.
I'm still suspicious because uh, as soon as I hear, okay, well, they've lost the Senate and they've lost the House. Well, now they haven't lost the Senate at all. Now it's looking at the Senate is definitely staying Democratic. And then I think the more we delay, the more we go toward the station. If I'm an astrologer, I'm thinking, yeah, please delay. Just hold off. Let me know. I want to know the result third week of November, December. That's
Right,
cool
right.
because it fits really,
That
really
makes a
well
difference.
with what that
Yeah.
is. And that's what I don't know. It's I do have McCarthy's time, and overall the station is worse for McCarthy. That's another telltale sign too, that where they're lining up
Right.
much better for Biden. But I know it's a bit of a reach because you can then argue it from another vantage point where astrology can get really complicated. If you know a chart like McCarthy's, you know that 2023 is going to be really hard. But that could be because he has to manage Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Because think about
Right.
it, if they win the House, those two are going to run the party. They're going to be the two
Right.
votes that will say, well, if you don't allow us to impeach everybody, then we're not going to go along with you.
Yeah.
And I'm exaggerating, but you get
No,
the
but
gist.
it'll be the Freedom Caucus and Ryan all over again, where he couldn't get it together. And
Right.
that it's so interesting that you say that because when I was you know looking at the races and just kind of giving what my guides were saying, and it was like, yeah, looks like we're going to keep the Senate. The House, it looks a little more uh but since I'm not quite sure, let's just ask and follow into this energy of what if we lose it? What does that look like? And it was exactly what you're saying, that McCarthy would have such a hard time, or whoever's in charge would have such a hard time of getting these two fractions to agree that nothing, we basically stand still for a couple of years, but we don't go back. We just kind of stand still because they can't get themselves to do anything. They're just at odds with each other. And this whole thing with Trump kind of losing and losing and losing, that's another complication. That's another thing that makes people say, wait a minute, do I want to be associated with this guy? And so they go the opposite direction. So they're in disarray, as we, they
Yeah,
always like to
yeah,
say that about the Democrats, but they are in disarray right now.
yeah. I mean, and this is where if you really do it black and white, like I remember what happened to Liz Cheney, and I said, well, her chart is really good, but then it wasn't good enough to avoid that loss in Wyoming because of the politics. That said, her chart is still really good. And Liz Cheney is much more likely than not to have all kinds of major political impact now and for years to come, for sure. So then Biden too. This is a really good moment for Biden. And that takes everything into account. It's not just that things turned out, mostly okay, is that it could be what you just said, which could be that if they get the House, then whatever happens in the next 2 years plays to his favor, which wouldn't be the first time because these, GOP people have an amazing way of doing things backward, against their own
Right.
interest. So it could easily happen. I see why I would prefer to see an upset and have the count still turn out with keeping the House. It's just because they're not operating in good faith. I mean, you look at the way they play. These are bad faith actors. They consistently
Right.
play to the low side. And I remember seeing it originally around 2010 when the Tea Party came in, and I used to see Ted Cruz. I mean, just on TV, just lying through his teeth, and I used to think, you're just making stuff up. You're just making it up. Oh, it's all the Democrats' fault. And I'm thinking, you did this. You're the one that just called for whatever. He'd say, oh, the Democrats did it.
Right.
So then it just gets worse and worse. There's this corruption that follows along, and I mean, I would be amazed. We can say whatever about McCarthy or whoever they put in there, because that's the other thing. If they win the House, no guarantee that McCarthy gets the job at all. In fact, I would
Right.
probably say
Right.
they're going to get someone else. But then, what are the odds that they're not going to do some crazy things? These are people that, for the last more than a decade, are always looking for a Benghazi to create an investigation that has no substance, no grounds,
Right.
pretending, that it's. And so then I think, well, if they're there, they're going to be spending a lot of time doing that. But maybe you're right. Maybe they discover right away that they can't do that, and then somehow it plays to Biden's advantage. I don't know. That's hard to
Right.
fill in, you know. But
Right.
it's true too, though, that once again, uh, Scorpio. One of the things about Scorpio that is like, going to the therapist who says, okay, I know you're not feeling so well right now, but it's gonna get better in the spring because Saturn will switch signs. That's true because Saturn, when it goes into Pisces, aligns well with Scorpio. It stops pressuring the
Right.
energy. So if you're kind of hemmed in and you feel held back and so forth, it changes. That's astrology 101. It does it every time. And since he's a Scorpio, you think
Same thing.
that's not pointing to next year him fending off, like being impeached, for instance. That just seems
Right. Right.
completely
Right.
preposterous. Yeah, like for what? like Obama
Well,
asked.
that's it, right?
Yeah.
You have to have something. So, so that kind of leads me to my next question because um, when you do, when I'll read for somebody, I always say, guides try to give you a heads up, but you have control. You
Mhm.
have control of your fate. So, do you see astrology the same way that it's going to tell you stuff like this planet is coming in this will be this direction, and so things will be more difficult, but since you know this now, you can kind of counteract it. So do you feel like that's the role of astrology when you kind of give people it's like a heads up kind of thing?
100%. You've just, you're asking me the question I like to answer because, no, seriously, I first felt this around maybe the 10th year or between around there. I began to really get this sense of how it worked because I could see that the cycles were reflecting back to me my level of confidence and my previous actions. I
Mhm.
could say, well, I was doing that, now I'm here. That's why this is happening. This isn't fate. Fate means things just come at me at random.
Right.
There is no such
Right.
thing. So I try to do the chart from the perspective of, okay, you're in these cycles. How do you take this energy and get your planets to work better through the transit? Which, in fact, this is where, if you're on a difficult transit, and you don't let it scare you, it's even better than when you're in a easy transit because chances are through the dynamic irritation of the period you can grow more. That's the irony of being alive.
Mhm.
Like in planets that are at odds motivate more and help you toward growth. I noticed this many years ago when I was under the false impression that if planets were circulating in easy aspects, people would be complaining, oh, I don't like my job, I want to leave my job. And I would always notice
Mhm.
that they would leave the job when the planet put pressure, not when the planet was easy. It would be, I got to go.
All
So then a
right.
Saturn square would bring about the move, but not a Saturn trine, which is an easy aspect. So, yeah, to answer your question, I actually call my astrology proactive astrology instead of predictive astrology, just because, yeah, I know you can predict certain things, but it's a
Right.
fool's errand because I actually say that 80% of your life is you and 20% is your fate. So why don't you just work with the 80%? It's a great 80-20,
Yeah.
which is, by the way, it's sort of the logic. What is the 80%? Put your mind on where you want to go. Do that. Keep putting your mind on the direction that you would like to go in. And it's okay if it's a little bit off because you'll adjust, right?
Right.
But you are, yeah, constantly tuning in that way. And then what you said too, that once you're aware, okay, I'm on a Saturn period, yeah, it can get a
Right.
little rougher, but then you can say, okay, well, I mean, at the very least I can do is wait it out because I know that, this month and then it's going to get easier. And there, all I can tell you is I've seen it so many times. Yeah, I trust it because it works. It does
Yeah.
do that. You get a planet and it's there and then it isn't. Like how it's the essence of Buddhism. Everything is impermanent.
Yes, that exactly sounds
Yeah,
like that. It does. It sounds like,
yeah,
yeah, everything, this too shall pass. Everything is kind of on the
yeah.
way in or on the way out. So, um,
Exactly, exactly, exactly.
so let's switch to a couple of other countries. And I don't know if you have done uh, either charts on these two people or these two countries, but could you talk a little bit about Ukraine and Russia? Zelensky and Putin. What's
Right,
going how where the planets tell us that is leading or what's going
right.
on there?
Okay, so I remember the moment of the crisis and the spring of what is the spring of 20, it was the spring this last year, right? Yeah. So when
Yeah.
so now Zelensky, you can see in his chart major problems, of course. One of them is that he's an Aquarius, which means Saturn is in his sign. So as soon as Saturn is in your sign and you're leading a country that is next door to Russia, you might get a problem like this, or it could have been an alternative problem, but certainly the potential for that is there. That's one thing. And
Right.
then he's got this thing which at the time I thought was extremely dangerous. He's got these angles that are related to health and death. Of course, I thought, well, that's pretty great. I mean, you're being invaded by a foreign army and you've got health and
Right.
death aspects. And I remember saying, this to get him killed, he's got to be careful. But the alternative, or you could say the side by side interpretation would be, well, whether or not you yourself get killed, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of death, which is exactly what's been
Mhm.
happening. It's a really complicated alignment. But the thing to say, well, when does this change? That is the Saturn cycle too, because Saturn gets out of Aquarius in the spring of 2023. And I
Mhm.
remember back in when this started, I was seeing comments on my channel saying, well, I saw this great intuitive said that no, it's going to end in 3 weeks. This thing, and I remember saying, I just don't think so. I think we're looking at this is longer term. Part of it is how you say you just get an inkling because there's intuition without astrology too.
Yeah.
You look at things, you feel something. And to me, it felt this is gonna for sure goes into next year. So then you got to look to see what happens in the spring of 23 where the situation is going. But it does shift to a better place for Zelensky because it gets out of pressurizing his planets, like
Mhm.
his core planet. And then
Mhm.
for Putin is not good because Putin has all these planets in Libra. Then he's got one in Sagittarius, a really important one. But the point is, the Saturn cycle is very unfavorable, especially for health. And I'm really suspicious that he may be suffering from something that could be the kind of thing that is long term and gets really chronic and he can never get out of. Because when you see astrology that lasts for years and years, it's scary. And then the older
Right.
you are, the more risky this kind of thing can be. And he's got problems, going into like well into the middle of the decade and past that as a
Right.
result of where the Saturn cycle is. And even now, it's not, as you can see, I mean, look what's happening to the guy, right? But notice, interestingly, that one of the alignments is how we talked about Jupiter in a really nice alignment for Joe Biden, which it is. But
Mhm.
in the case of Putin, he's a Libra, and Jupiter is doing the transit in Aries on the other side. And one of the things with Jupiter when it's challenging you is that the person gets into their head expansionary moves that are not correct, that are off center somehow.
Oh,
So
right.
this thing that he's, I'm going to make it bigger. If you make it bigger, it'll almost certainly crash on you and not work. So it's another example
Right.
of being misaligned. Putin, from his chart, he had his chance. His moment was right around when of course, I mean, wouldn't it be so? When Trump got elected in 2016, Jupiter was going through Libra. Perfect. I think if he had invaded Ukraine, then Trump would have helped him. I swear he would have
Oh,
said,
yeah. I think
and
you're
then
absolutely right about that.
exactly. But now the timing is just not good, and the forces have changed. It's that simple, and it's if he, I would say the odds are better that he'll be replaced or thrown out or something that is negative.
Right.
The way I would
And
see Putin.
and it looks like the winter is going to be even more difficult than they could have ever imagined because he's done all this getting rid of so he's bombing all these grids and not realizing his own soldiers are there. So now they have to get out of there because it's like there's they're gonna freeze and yeah, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah, bad planning.
It's a tough situation, and
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the things though that where people can be so hard on the U.S. media, and they do make. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but the U.S. media is world class. I mean, look at all the times for example, we were watching the January 6th committee, and some of it was shocking and new, and wow, look at this. But a lot of it was known from really good reporting.
Yeah.
So people bring out the information, and it's pretty remarkable that we've been getting the feed, from Russia, and things happen approximately
Mhm.
the way the so-called mainstream media tells you this is happening and this is happening, and then a general comes on and says, and this other thing is happening, and that's what it is. The very opposite of what Putin likes, because he likes to disinform and tell you the opposite. Like, if there were no good media out there, he'd be just making up a
Oh,
totally different
yeah.
story. But you can't hide people dying. They say that
Right.
in Russia, I believe in the Afghanistan situation in the 80s, started to really fall apart when the Russian mothers were saying, where's my son? And it
Right.
wasn't just one, it was many. And so then pressure starts to build. And the way Putin is playing, this is the problem. It's true that he's fighting against a lot of American weapons. So in that sense, he's right that in a way it's America, you know, helping out Ukraine. It's true, but I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I've made this comment multiple times. Where are you going to go with, numbers tell you the story. He is the leader of a country with a $2 trillion economy, and the U.S. is 20 trillion, and the European Union is another 20 trillion. That's 40 trillion. And you think
Right.
you're going to outspend or outsort? You're not going to do this. It's too complicated.
Right.
They can keep
Right.
throwing energy at you, and then meanwhile the other countries, China says, yeah, we'll help you, but we're trading with the U.S. So and we can't help you that much.
Right.
So it's a problem. It's a problem because he needs to keep financing it, which for now he is. But I don't know. Based on his chart, I'd say about any astrologer would have told him this is not well timed. It's not going to work well,
Right.
and so yeah.
And as just as there is um formations in the planets that can give rise to disinformation, are there the same that counter that when truth comes out or when light is shed on things? Are there, because it just seems like all of a sudden we've hit this, we were in this kind of this deep well with Trump in, of this just being lied to over and over and over again, and Russia gaslighting us and just being gaslit and lied to constantly. And then all of a sudden it seems like, well, not only Biden is telling us this is the truth, but also we have the January 6th commission, the truth
Mhm.
commission, basically telling us exactly what's going on, all this stuff coming out, the light coming out from kind of showing us exactly what was going on underneath all of this. What would be happening there planetary wise that would be lending itself to us being able to hear truth instead of lies all of a sudden?
Well, I mean, in a way, there's you see, like if you think about the era we're in, more than ever before, you look what the January 6th committee did. They showed you what was happening with video, with evidence, with testimony. This is like
Mhm.
watching, an amazing Netflix series where you're just glued
Yeah.
to it. Going, wow, this is phenomenal.
Riveted.
Right, because it used to be, if you go back 30, 40 years, you'd read the article in the paper, which is, it's
Right.
good, but it's different. So that in a way is the tug of war between the Neptune energy, where one side is the truth. Neptune on the high end is the actual truth of things, the beauty
Right.
and the truth. The bottom end is the lies. So they're kind of operating concurrently. But at the same time, if you said, okay, well, that's true, but it feels like there's a stalemate, there I almost say that it's not so much that a planet comes in to save you, it's that you want the planet to leave so that it'll stop
Oh,
playing
right.
that game. So it getting out changes the scene. But there's also, you spoke earlier about historical patterns. They can
Hmm.
give you really good information, because I remember in 2020, one of the ways I made a case at the time, I said, I'm looking at this, we're going to get a progressive administration here next, and it certainly isn't Trump, which means
Right.
another nail in the coffin, so to speak. So
Right.
it's this thing that you spot in the Saturn cycle. Saturn is every 30 years, it does a full circle. So I looked back and I noticed that every time Saturn is transiting through Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, this zone of the zodiac, every time that's been the case, you get a progressive administration. The Bill Clinton administration, the JFK, and Johnson was the same thing. Further
Hmm.
back is Roosevelt in the 1930s. Despite, I mean, think about the U.S. then is in the middle of this fascist
Yeah.
Greece, but we had the most progressive administration. And then interestingly, before that, it's when the Republicans were the ones that were kind, right? So Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive Republican, and that was the period when you go 30 years before the other Roosevelt, and then
Mhm.
even going further back to the post Civil War period. I think it was the Ulysses S. Grant administration,
Mhm.
another progressive administration. So you've got this repeated pattern. Well, we're in it now because Saturn has been in Aquarius. Saturn entered Aquarius totally concurrent with Biden coming on the scene. Now we're going into the Pisces period, and then the Aries period follows after that. In fact, another interesting thing, which I'll bring up, around this, that a different astrologer, Patrick Watson, he's a well-known astrologer, and he's very good at doing research and finding patterns. That's what you're always trying to do with astrology. He points out that Saturn in Aries, which is where it's going next in the post 24 election, it'll switch into Aries. And
Mhm.
he noticed that every time it's been in Aries, you get important gun legislation. Now, you got to ask yourself, you think it's
Oh,
going to be a Republican administration doing that? Not
hell
too
no.
likely, right? So those are
Likely.
those are markers that tell you, okay, well, that's an encouraging thing that goes with the current trend, so to speak. I mean, it's never 100%, but
Right.
if you can get up in the 90s, it's pretty good because you get pretty good results that way.
Right.
Yeah. So, anyways, that was a long answer to say,
No, that's
no.
fascinating, and that's what I exactly what I was wondering. So that you've answered it perfectly. And I guess my last question for you, as we're kind of wrapping this up, is, um, so when people like me tap into something or do a reading or look into something, we're talking to our guides, right? Or that's what I say. I always say guides. Some people say angels, higher self, whatever you want to say. You're talking to something that's kind of just a little bit beyond you, that knows a little more.
Mhm.
Do you think it's possible that people like me are also tapping into the planets? That's speaking to us as well. We just don't recognize it as that.
Yeah, well, okay. So, I mean, of course, I'm completely biased because this is my model, right? But from my perspective, that's the only thing you can tap into, just in the sense
Right.
that, I mean, it's not even, see, where astrology is pretty amazing is that it's not just the planets individually. The planets are themselves reflections of something bigger. They have to be, just through the logic. As soon as you say, well, I'm tapping into something bigger, a
Mhm.
planet is a small thing. I mean, when you look at these planets, they're huge, but relative to the entire universe, they're really tiny. They're
Right.
nothing,
Mhm.
nothing. So they represent higher principles that exist. Like, for example, Saturn is the principle of contraction, of reducing something, of concentrating something. So the universe is in part that, and in part it's an expansive thing that is going on. That's Jupiter. So those two are the conduit to those energies, right? So when you're doing tapping in, yes, kind of indirectly, if you were trying to pin it on a planet, you could, but you're tapping into the principles that the planets themselves are reflecting, because they're not disconnected from the universe. They're in the universe. Matter of fact, this is the thing that when people ask me, well, why do you think astrology works? It sounds, it's like a right brain answer where you say because it's the universe and I'm in the universe. So how can they not work? It's the system that I'm in. It's all the energies are interplaying all the time,
Right.
so they must be affecting each other. It's that simple, right? So you're tapping in. Uh, Maybe you could fine tune it and go, well, now I tapped in a little more to this one or that one, but
Right.
essentially you're doing exactly that, yeah. And so as far as what you say, guides, higher power, I've never yet, even though I did a who did I read? Diane, from Diane Aquarius. She did
Mhm.
this really neat reading where she said to me that I have three guides, and I thought, well, like, what do you mean? I've never.
What are you
You
talking
think,
about?
okay, like, where are you? That hasn't been. If I have three guides, it's almost like they speak without speaking in some way.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I see it as a sense of the way you put it, higher power, the universe itself. This notion that because I've had a lot of astrology in my life, but I've also done a lot of work on studying systems of religion, and actually practicing a lot. And one of my, long-term practices, I love Zen, And in Zen, they tell you, and to me, this feels intuitively true. In Zen, they say you're always at one with the universe. You just don't know it, but you are. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
not possible not to be, because it's true. If you,
Right.
you know, meditate enough, you realize, yeah, I'm here. Where else could I be? This is it. There's no sense that it's somewhere else. It's right here. So then, the guidance. That's a good word that I like. Guidance comes
Mhm.
in to, help you along. And I can even see, by the way, where a person could have like negative guides or the idea of being helped by the opposite, because you kind of wonder, like people like Trump, like what are they tapping into, that they're always looking
Right.
for, how can I do something malevolent now to screw something up and upset somebody. It almost feels like there's a demon, helping.
On their shoulder. Yeah,
Yeah,
the good and the bad. Yeah,
yeah,
I agree. To me, it just seems like people like him are uh, cut off completely from that part of us that's divine. They're cut off from it. They're completely and totally absorbed in the um, the 3D world. They're completely cut off from anything bigger, higher, and I think that can happen, right? When you're involved with tons of money, tons of power, and everybody
mhm.
like that, everybody around you is like that, it's very easy to get sucked in, I think, to
It
that,
is. It is. And this
you
is where
know.
you get into arguments with people. Like this has happened on my channel more than once, where I try to make a difference between, look at the way Trump behaves, look at the way even Elon Musk or even Bezos behave. And for instance, a good counterpoint is a guy like Bill Gates, who immediately assumes, oh, billionaire, he's terrible. He's not nearly as terrible. He's far more conscious of it's social money, and he's using it to put it back into society in big numbers. Now you can then
Right,
say, well, he should do even more, but you see more of a conscious, more of a sense of unity, of connecting with people, connecting with the system you're in, and not just creating an ivory tower ego. That it's all for you
right,
and everybody else can just tough it out. So I think there
right.
is a difference even at that level of
I think you're right. And I think that is the difference, right? That consciousness, being conscious of I'm part of something rather than it's just me and I'm the only one that matters, which is it's so Trump. That's what he is.
yeah.
That's
And
all
by the
he
way,
is.
momentum too. If you This is
Right.
another sort of life truth. The more you do something, the more you're likely to continue doing it. So every time you're
Mm,
doing something egotistical, another egotistical thing will follow. So if you see a billionaire doing something good, be happy, because there are good odds he'll probably do it again, because you realize this is good. I mean, with Bill Gates, he helped correct a lot of the health problems in the third world. By the
yeah.
way, just as a quick one, it's gonna make you laugh, because Bill Gates is a Scorpio, like you, and he's a Scorpio with early in the sign, right? So one of the things that Scorpio rules, among many, because signs that way are, but Scorpio is literally like, excrement. Like it's the, sign where it rules garbage and excrement. And he happens to have a really technological planet. Uranus in his chart is really powerful. Of course, it would be, because that's why he became a software mogul and all that. But
Right.
he invented this. I turned on Netflix one day and I see him. He built this, created this incredible for the third world, because they have a lot of problems with waste matter. He created it's like the size of a room, this toilet thing that converts waste matter into drinking water. And I thought that is so scorpionic, because that's what Scorpio does. Scorpio is the sign where, like, to give you an example of, it's the idea that Scorpio is the manure that helps the vegetables to grow even better, because you're taking dead matter and transforming it into something. So I just thought it was,
And it's a perfect example too of of that thing that can go either way, right? The Scorpio, or I guess any sign can do that, but Scorpio, you can really see that very
oh yeah, no,
clearly.
no, no. I mean, if you're watching true crime, like the most horrific stuff that can happen, and there are some really, really horrible human beings. Scorpio's on the scene, because Scorpio is that. But Scorpio rules, of course, as you would expect, great detectives. Scorpio, great
Right, right.
psychologists, people that are probing, discovering something deep, but you don't know which way it'll go. That's where, depends on the role the
It
person
can
is
be
playing, where
very,
they're at, and so forth. So yeah, it's fascinating.
it is fascinating. Well, Andre, thank you so much for coming on and talking about all of this and making things so much clearer. I think and I can understand and I'm able to understand it. And so where can people find you? And also, do you do private readings? What do you offer?
Yeah, well, the easiest way is, if you if you type astrology alert in YouTube, I'll pop up. And then if you go to the about section of the channel, it tells you how to contact me. I do individual readings, and I do them as I described earlier with a kind of an angle on getting the planets to work for you. Like we
Right.
assess where you are, what are you trying to do, where are the planets now, and where are they going, and what's the best way to work this to your advantage. So things will grow, so you can avoid obstacles and so forth. A proactive approach to it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put all that information below so people can find it. And thank you so much for
Oh,
coming
it's a
on.
pleasure, and I look forward to having you on my channel, and I'll ask you about where you found your intuition and how all of that works, because I'm sure that'll be really interesting as well, right?
I would love that. I would love that. All right. You take
All right.
care. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.